そこ閉めようか。So, would you like to start the afternoon session about extreme updraft and wind gust using drop zone observation and radiation simulations by Professor Stans. Please.
Thank you.
And we prepared 1 hour, but you can extend more.
Okay. just tell me when you want me to be quiet.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. So this lecture is about observations of extreme low-level updrafts that tend to occur in the Eyewall region of tropical cyclones that I studied using a dropson data set. And then further insight that we can gain from using large eddy simulations. And some of this topic overlaps with the presentation I gave 2 days ago, so some of you may have seen some of the slides before, but there's this lecture also has more focus on the updrafts, and in addition to the extreme wind gusts that I talked about a couple of days ago. So this is photos from the landfall of Hurricane Andrew, which was an intense Category 5 hurricane in Miami, Florida in 1992. And this just shows that you can get extreme damaging wind gusts in tropical cyclones. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we observe tropical cyclones and how that relates to our sampling capabilities of the local updrafts and extreme wind gusts. And then I'm going to talk about this dropson data set that I've analyzed of the extreme updrafts and the wind gusts. And then the last part of the talk will be about how we can use large eddy simulations to understand the structure and dynamics of updrafts and wind gusts and the vortices that I believe are associated with both the updrafts and the wind gusts. So this is the same photo from the title slide of damage in the neighborhood in South Florida from Hurricane Andrew, just to illustrate that strong hurricanes can cause tremendous wind damage and that this damage can be extremely localized, where we have some structures that are completely destroyed right next to other structures that are largely intact with minimal damage. So this indicates that there's some small-scale structure that's responsible for this damage. And some of you saw this the other day. This is a board driven through a palm tree. So that takes a very strong wind to be able to do that kind of damage. And then sometimes we have more widespread damage where whole neighborhoods are destroyed.
Did you take this photo?
Sorry, no, I did not take any of these photos. I should have put a photo credit. These are, I think they're NOAA photos, or they're storm damage survey photos that I think are available on NOAA websites. I would have been 9 years old at this time, so I was not in Florida to take these photos. I took this photo. Which is when I was my first year of classes at University of Miami. So this is downtown Miami, Florida, a 50-story building that had most of its windows shattered by debris from other buildings. And this was only a Category 1 hurricane, so even relatively weak storms can still cause not catastrophic, but significant damage.
So wind itself shut out the windows or
No,
the debris?
So windows, unless the window is really poorly made, it should not blow out until you get really strong winds like Category 4 or more. But if a rock hits a window at a relatively weak speed, it can easily shatter the window. And so the problem that they found was that the rooftops of buildings in Miami had gravel on the top. And so that gravel gets picked up by the wind and gets thrown against another building, and then it shatters the windows. So it's sort of a poor design in a way. And then once the window is shattered, then the structure is breached and like stuff can get torn out of it. So yeah, if in the absence of debris hitting the windows, like this shouldn't happen in a Category 1. And this is just what happened to my car in Hurricane Naval. This was also from debris hitting the car window, and then it rained inside after that. So I no longer have this car, although it wasn't destroyed by the hurricane, but eventually I hit a deer. And then
You got a new car by the insurance.
no. I got a new window and a new stereo by insurance. Just a few $100s in damage. Yeah, no, my car wasn't destroyed by this.
Oh my god.
So I'm going to talk in the next few slides a bit about how we observe tropical cyclones. This is a satellite image of Hurricane Hugo in 1989. This was also a Category 5 tropical cyclone. The scale of the circulation is 400 or 500 kilometers. But the strongest winds are confined to a relatively narrow region in the Eyewall here, with a scale of only 50 to maybe 100 kilometers diameter. To sample tropical cyclones, in the Atlantic we have the 2 NOAA P-3 aircraft that will fly in numerous flights, maybe 20, 30 flights every year in a number of different storms, and have equipped with instruments with Doppler radars and dropsondes, and measures the flight level variables as well. And this is an example of an observation from Hurricane Hugo. So this same storm, not at exactly the same time, but while the storm was a Category 5 storm, Hugo was sampled by this P-3 aircraft. This is from the Marks et al. 2008 study. This shows the radar reflectivity from the airplane with the eyewall, and this white arrow shows the track of one of the aircraft. There were actually 2 aircraft flying in the storm at the same time. And so the aircraft that I'm going to talk about flew into the storm from the southwest through this very intense convection in the southwest eyewall. And you can see, so the scale of this figure is 120 by 120 kilometers. So the eyewall is only maybe 10, 20 kilometers wide. So this very small region with very intense convection. And the plane was flying at only about 500 meters height above the surface. So you might think that's not safe. And that's correct, it is not safe. This is just to illustrate the show where you the eyewall and the eye region inside there. So this is the data, this is the radial cross-section of the reflectivity as the plane was flying towards the center. So time here is increasing to the right. So this is a period of about 8 minutes. And the radius from the center is shown up here. So this is about 60 kilometers over this 8-minute period as the plane is flying from left to right here towards the center. You can see that outside the eyewall, this is the radar reflectivity bright band in the stratiform region. The vertical velocity derived from the Doppler radar is the contours, the black contours. So weak vertical motion outside of the eyewall. But in the eyewall, this concentrated region of intense reflectivity is associated with a concentrated region of strong updrafts of 5 to 10 meters per second. And it's a small eyewall. Armed up, the eyewall is about 10 kilometers at low levels, and you can see the outward slope. And then the eye is the region here with no reflectivity in it.
So the slope is changing near 9 kilometers
Of the reflectivity field, yeah. Yeah, it seems like it's nearly vertical at low mid levels, and then a steeper slope above. And I think it's typical that the slope is going to start increasing a lot in the upper troposphere.
Decreasing. The gradient is decreasing with height.
The gradient.
Gradient is not constant, but gradient is getting.
Oh yeah, the slope is not constant with height. Yeah, it tends to be close to constant in the lower mid troposphere, and then you kind of get the eyewall really flaring outward in observations and simulations. But the focus here is really going to be on the low level. So. So the plane again is flying very low, basically like 500 meters, so below just the reflectivity here. And so these are the flight level variables along this cross section. And there's a lot of lines here, but first focus on the wind speed. And so outside of the eyewall, the wind speed is weak, 20, 30 meters per second. It slowly increases as you go towards the eyewall, but it really starts rapidly increasing right in the eyewall region. And Hugo was very strong, and this is a wind speed measured by the aircraft of about 90 meters per second. You can see that it gets pretty turbulent here. There's fluctuations in the wind speed, and in the eyewall, there's extreme fluctuations. So there's the wind speed decreases by from 90 to 60 meters per second over just a kilometer or so distance, and then rapidly increases again to 80 meters per second over less than a kilometer before dropping incredibly sharply to 20 meters per second, again over about a kilometer or two. So this indicates there's very intense vorticity here in this region. And these rapid fluctuations, Marx et al. Attributed to small-scale vortices that are right along the interface of the eye and the eyewall. And associated with these yes?
So how high is this flight? This aircraft is flight about 2 or 3 kilometer high?
No, the aircraft, in this case, the aircraft was flying very low, about 500 meters.
So that P value is direct observation by the aircraft. That is how
So the value there is the estimate of the surface pressure. So like the plane, even when it's flying at 2 kilometers, whenever it's flying in the lower troposphere, it estimates the surface pressure. By hydrostatic, and that's usually pretty accurate. So yeah, this is the surface pressure estimated by the plane while it's flying at 500 meters height. Associated with these strong fluctuations in wind speed that you see in the eyewall are very strong updrafts. So this is vertical velocity in this blue line here. It has the scale is the same as the horizontal wind speed. And so this is 20 meters per second upwards at a height of only 450 meters. So that's incredibly strong. It's very turbulent.
Is this in our C blast?
No, C blast was I think 2004.
Okay.
This was just
Typical.
this was just a regular research mission by the Hurricane Research Division. Back then, they flew very low. And there are a number of other flights, like I think from the 50s, 60s, 70s, where they would make these very low-level flights in the eyewall of intense hurricanes. And looking back, it's lucky that the plane didn't crash during these. And because the plane almost did crash in Hurricane Hugo. They lost power to engines, and they lost altitude, and so we're only a couple hundred meters above the ocean and had to circle in the eye for a period while the other plane found a weak reflectivity area in the eyewall that they could try to leave from, and they were able to leave safely. but it was a very close call. And so this is the last flight at which they flew that low in the Eyewall. So now the only way to get these type of measurements would be to have an unmanned aircraft fly there. So there, you see the vertical velocity outside the eyewall is weak, less than a meter per second generally. And then as we get to the eyewall, you start getting stronger updrafts, and now we have like this series of about 4 updrafts and downdrafts, and many of the updrafts that are 5 to 10 meters per second are followed by strong downdrafts of 10 meters per second. And the very intense, the updrafts are closely associated with the very rapid changes in the horizontal wind speed. So there's evidence that you're getting strong updrafts that are probably co-located with very strong vorticity. So these are the vortices. The plane is flying through a couple small kilometer scale or less vortices that are associated with very strong updraft, downdraft couplets. So in the absence of, this is like I said, it's a fairly unique flight because it was unsafe and they don't fly there anymore. So it would be nice to have flight level time series through strong typhoons and hurricanes, but until we have unmanned aircraft that can routinely fly through the eyewall, we need more remote instruments. So one tool for being able to do that is the GPS dropson, which both the NOAA P3s and the Air Force C-130s will drop dozens of these instruments in a hurricane as they fly through it. So the GPS dropson, for anyone not familiar, is a small tube about this big that has that measures temperature, pressure, humidity, and retrieves the wind speed from the GPS, and falls on this parachute at about 10 meters per second. And from either the GPS or from the pressure, you can estimate the vertical wind speed, and by subtracting off the terminal fall speed that you would get if there was no wind. So I want to use this plot just to illustrate how we typically sample hurricanes with dropsons in the Atlantic. So this is a satellite image of Hurricane Earl, the same storm I talked about in my last presentation. This is from the satellite. You can see that Earl is developing at this time. It isn't really that strong, or maybe it might be a Category 1 hurricane is my guess from this satellite image. This is a hypothetical flight track that my colleague at NRL, Will Kamormi, made this plot for me. And this shows where a plane might be taking off from Barbados and flies towards the storm, and then it'll enter from the southeast in this case, make a radial penetration from southeast to northwest, and then they'll fly downwind to the southwest quadrant, and then make another radial penetration from southwest to northeast. And so that's called a figure 4 pattern, and then they might repeat that pattern and do that again. And so in this pattern, you get 8 penetrations of the eyewall, so 4 passes with one each side of the eyewall, and typically they'll drop a dropson sort of at the outer edges of the leg, so this is away from the inner core, and then they'll drop a sonde in the eye, and when they enter the eyewall, they'll drop a sonde. And so you might get 4 sondes in the eyewall, or maybe 8 sondes in the eyewall, typically for a flight into a tropical cyclone. And this is an example of the actual dropson coverage for a flight into Hurricane Earl. This is from NOAA. This is the radar-derived wind speed analysis at 2 kilometers height. And then overlaid on that are the dropsons. So dropsons are pretty accurate instruments for wind speed, and so you can see that here that's a 60-knot wind or 30 meter per second wind, and that corresponds to the same color. So the radar and the dropson compare fairly well. So this has been proven to be a very useful instrument for measuring the wind speed in tropical cyclones. But the key point is that sampling is typically very sparse by the dropsons. So the radius of maximum wind is in here, and just like the hypothetical plan, we just have a couple drop signs in the eyewall for any given flight. And in real hurricanes, we have asymmetries in the wind field, and so there's usually one half or one quadrant of the storm that has the strongest wind. And so if we want to sample that strongest wind, we have to drop a sonde in that quadrant. And so maybe you'll have one or two sondes that are in the location where you might sample the strongest wind. So that's, while it's useful, that's pretty sparse. You're usually going to miss sampling the peak wind. Occasionally, we have flights where you have much finer sampling than you do typically. The most that you would usually have would be, well, usually you'd have just one or two sondes, but in some flights you'll have up to 8 sondes through the eyewall. This is one of those flights. This is Hurricane Isabel, when it was a Category 5 hurricane. This is a 30-kilometer box showing the reflectivity for just the southeast quadrant of the storm. The plane was flying away from the center towards the eyewall from northwest to southeast. And they released 8 drop sondes, and the lines here show the horizontal trajectories of these 8 sondes. So starting from the eyewall interface, the inner edge of the eyewall, and then into the core of the eyewall. And then these are the times that they were dropped. So they're dropping sondes about 10 to 20 seconds apart from each other. So you get really fine radial resolution here. But this is not typical. We rarely have this. And we can take a look at where the flight level variables. So these are time series of flight level wind speed, and on the left, and flight level vertical velocity on the right for this flight that I just showed you the radar for. So the scale here, this is 4 minutes of data, which is about 30 kilometers. So the eye is out here, and the wind speed is increasing radially outward. One thing that's interesting to note, you can see like in the inner part of the eye an approximately linear increase in wind speed, and the wind speed doesn't fluctuate that much. It's relatively smooth here. And you can clearly see how the eyewall region and the outer part of the eye becomes very turbulent because we have these really large fluctuations of 5 to 10 meters per second. And then again, outside the eyewall, you tend to start to get less fluctuations and less turbulence. And if you look at the flight level vertical velocity, you can see you can see this turbulence in the vertical velocity clearly because we have this big updraft of 15 meters per second. This flight's about 2 kilometers height, I think, the plane was flying. And so we have these about a 6 to 8 kilometer wide region of updraft, but within that updraft there's these fluctuations between 14 and 6 meters per second, so there's these smaller scale features on the order of a kilometer or two. And then each dot here, each colored dot corresponds to the time and location along the profile at which one of those drop sondes was dropped. So that blue sonde here, so this is right at the edge of the eyewall. It's really in the eye actually at flight level, and that's this point. So a sonde was dropped there where the winds were about 50 meters per second. And it's important to remember the eye is not all calm. Like there's a region of the eye where it's dry and warm, and there's no clouds, but the winds are still really fast. And so this is just at the edge of the eyewall, and then we're sampling across the eyewall. And so some of these sondes were dropped into downdrafts, some of them were dropped into updrafts in the core of the eyewall updraft, and then a few are sort of outside the eyewall. And so these are the vertical profiles of vertical velocity. These are both vertical velocity. These are just splitting it into the 2 pairs of 4 different sondes. So these are the first 4 sondes, and these are the second 4 sondes on the right. And yeah, the plane was around 2 kilometers height, and so and the scale, if you can't read it, it goes from -8 to +16 meters per second vertical velocity. So the interesting thing here is that the first 3 sondes all sampled what I refer to as extreme updrafts, which I defined in my study as 10 meters per second. And so they all sampled extreme updrafts at about the same height, around 12 to 1400 meters. And you can see very sharp fluctuations in the vertical velocity. It's very turbulent. And if you go back, like, to see where it is along the flight level, so that this first drop sonde was actually kind of in the downdraft region, just inside of the eyewall. And then it fell into the sloping eyewall and sampled a low-level extreme updraft. And there's large updrafts in many of these sondes, even the ones without the extreme updrafts. And you can see that this 6th sonde in the sequence samples has relatively weak vertical velocity, and actually a downdraft for much of the profile, and then right near the surface at 200 to 300 meters is a really strong to extreme updraft. So there's a lot of interesting structure here, and you can see that across the eyewall, multiple sondes sample extreme updrafts. And this is the horizontal wind speed for those same sondes. There's some missing data here, but the sondes that sampled really extreme updrafts also sampled extreme horizontal wind speeds. And there's also very large fluctuations in the horizontal wind speed. And in one case, we have a horizontal wind speed of almost 95 meters per second, so very strong. For the first couple of sondes, you can infer that it was dropped inside the eye because there's a lot of missing data, but you can see this black sonde here, the winds were very weak at 1,500 meters and increased from 60 to 90 meters per second over the 600 meter later. So that's a consequence of being dropped in the eye and then falling into the maximum winds below. And then you can see the outer sondes. So we can see these 4 sondes that are sort of dropped in the middle of the eyewall reflectivity region, the intense reflectivity, which at flight level are outside of the radius, or right across and then to outside the radius of maximum winds. We can see that at the top of the profiles at around 2 kilometers, the winds are already very strong, and they're close to constant on average, because this is being dropped outside of the boundary layer wind jets. So in that region, the winds are not changing systematically with height nearly as much, and you tend to have less sharp fluctuations in these sondes. The study by Marks et al., as well as a few other studies, suggested that intense hurricanes had very strong turbulent fluctuations in wind speed and vertical velocity, and hypothesized and showed some evidence for having small vortices that formed along the eye-eyewall interface that led to these extreme updrafts as well as extreme wind gusts. And so that's sort of the motivation for this work, and along with the fact that I found by looking at drop sondes that you can get a 10 to 25 meter per second updrafts within and near the tropical cyclone boundary layer. So this is another Isabel sonde that exhibited a 22 meter per second updraft at only 1,300 meters height. So that's very strong for a low-level updraft. And I'm not going to get into it in this presentation, but these updrafts are not buoyant. You can't explain them with buoyancy because the thermal perturbation associated with the updraft would be 10 to 20 Kelvin, which is much larger than is possible and is observed. So these